The Fetzer Institute Administration Building has many significant symbols built into it, many harkening back to ancient Egypt, including the obelisk in the parking lot, and the winged horse and Isis and Nephthys at the entrances. The building also features the hologram and black waterfall in the atrium, and there are others, including the shape of the building itself. In this video, we learn from former Masonic Grand Master Akram Elias that many of these symbols have Masonic significance, or are even Masonic in origin. In this section of the Memorial Trust discussions with Mr. Elias, we interview him at the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C., about the purpose and indeed great significance of classical symbolism to the Masons. Then we discuss with him, in a Kalamazoo sit-down, the Fetzer logo. Then we walk with Akram, discussing with him as we go, through the many important Masonic symbols, first at various sites in Washington, D.C., and finally at the Fetzer Institute itself. Let's start a new topic, Masonic symbolism. Masonic symbolism and the influence on the Johnny Fetzer Institute Administration Building symbols. Our first question is, what is the purpose generally of the prominence of classical symbolism in Freemasonry, particularly Egyptian, whether it's the obelisk, the winged horse, the dual goddesses Isis and Nephthys, also classical Greek with the pillars, other elements of classical architecture, goddesses such as Minerva, and then there are goddesses in the American tradition, liberty and victory. What is the purpose? What's the power behind those symbols?
Well, the language of symbolism is the language of Freemasonry, and a lot of the symbols come from ancient civilizations, from different parts of the world, but they all have one thing in common, and that is building. Since we are a society of free Masons, free builders, so if one keeps these two words always in mind, freedom and builder, everything starts making sense. So we look for symbols that have to do with the building enterprise, and signs and symbols that point to enlightened freedom, to be a Freemason. So when it comes to the ancient Egyptians being considered as the greatest Masons in the actual building, stone building, they did not use metal, did not use mortar nor cement in their structures. That was definitely, it makes sense to go back to ancient Egypt and pick some of the symbols that are associated with the building enterprise. So the pyramid and the obelisk come to mind because these are two of the most important Egyptian symbols that the ancient Egyptians left behind for future generations of humans to admire. So Freemasonry has taken these two and incorporated them in many ways in our ritual, but then you see how that Masonic influence was also projected into the American enterprise, that is the American experiment, as a spiritual enterprise, which is one reason why you see the pyramid incorporated in the Great Seal of the United States, which one finds on the back of a dollar bill going back to 1782. And the obelisk is prominently on display. Of course, it's found in many cities across the country, especially the first states, formerly 13 colonies. But in Washington, D.C., it is prominently on display as the official monument to George Washington. So the founders of the United States were building a new enterprise, a new experiment. It makes sense to have the Great Seal under a pyramid with Novus Ordo Seclorum, new order for the ages. That's what they were building, a new order for the ages. Washington being the first among equals, as we say, among the builders, it makes sense to have his official monument, an obelisk, a symbol of building, because he was the builder, also par excellence, if you want, among the founders. So that's to give you an example why we do it. You see the classical, if we go to the Greeks and the Romans in Washington, D.C., the neoclassical style of architecture dominates, whether it's in the Capitol building, the Supreme Court, etc. Well, we've incorporated that also in the rituals of Freemasonry. We talk about the classical orders. As builders, let's build, again, with strength and beauty in mind. So we emphasize, the Doric, the Ionic, the Tuscan, the Corinthian, etc., the 5 classical orders, Greco-Roman. So you can see the influence in the building of Washington, D.C., Greco-Roman side. This is all on the building side as few examples. Let me now highlight, by giving few examples, highlight the spiritual, the freedom aspect of it. The sun is that symbol of freedom that diffuses light. The moon, that freedom of receiving, I'm receiving and reflecting. Freedom on top of the goddess freedom, or freedom statue as it is commonly known, on top of the Capitol facing the sun, the source of light. Esoterically meaning that freedom really is the result of enlightenment. So it makes sense, again, to go back to some of these symbols that had to do with freedom in the ancient world. They used physical symbols like the sun, like the moon, to convey that. The feminine is also used in ancient mythology to express the concept of the sacred feminine, which is to complement the masculine, which is necessary for creation and life to go on. So you find in the city the women as a statue, the feminine physical form, representing concepts which are very important to this experiment. Very important to the Freemason. So justice, liberty, equality, fraternity, they're constantly represented by the feminine, but they all relate ultimately to the concept of freedom. There is no true freedom if there is injustice. You may think, one may live under the illusion of being free. If you're surrounded by injustice, you're not free. So justice is important, fraternity is important. And when you take these concepts in mind and you build the cardinal virtues, temperance, fortitude, always represented again by the feminine, you put them all together, they emanate from one word, and that is the source of everything. That's love. So,
does it go beyond a message, though, that's delivered? Do symbols in Masonic tradition actually trigger the subconscious mind, or do they create an energy? Are they a part of this inner process that's in the ritualistic magic of the lodge room? The symbols are there, and then the vision of the symbols with a open, receptive consciousness. Do the symbols actually trigger? Is that part of the process of symbology? And
yes, it is. Whether they trigger everyone in the room is a different story, but they do. They're there to do two things. One, to trigger for the person who is ready, focused, and willing. And at the same time, they help create an energy as we do the ritual and do whatever it is we're doing together. So it's really both. It's not one or the other, it's both. And it all depends then on the state of mind, the state of presence, I must say, of the person in that lodge. That is how connected to the sacred atmosphere the person is. Now, some lodges try to help create the atmosphere and the environment one way or another to facilitate further that. So some lodges you will see how as soon as they're about to open after the meditation part, you see the lights really dimmed, there is music. So the use of light and music are used to create this atmosphere. But the actual degree ceremonies, I mean, if done properly and if one is focused, I know it happened to me. In each case, I feel something go up and down my spine. As simple as that. That's why mystery schools always use symbols. you tie yourself. Words, no matter how poetic the person is, one symbol is powerful. Is so powerful. No words can ever really capture the essence of one symbol.
Right. I think it takes off right from what you're talking about here. Just your last statement here. Mr. Fetzer, in the 1989 Founders Statement, the last thing he wrote to his board, he includes an esoteric reference to the triangle and square, and I want to read it to you and have you comment on it. He said, quote, "Let us look for a moment at the foundation and its symbol and meaning." So that's the Fetzer logo, which is a downward pointing triangle with the J and the F in it. We have a triangle, and that triangle has 3 points of service within the foundation: body, mind, and spirit. And yet, within that triangle, there is the 4 square that makes up the activities of the foundation of working within humankind on a physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual level. For in order to have perfect balance, we must have the perfect awareness. We must have the understanding of body, of mind, and of spirit, and we must have balance of the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual, in order that we might find fully the true spiritual expression leading to complete healing. Now, this was written he was 89 years old when he wrote this, and yet it sounds very Masonic to me. So what would be your Masonic view of that?
Well, I mean, every time you do anything with Masonry, there are 2 symbols there are no escaping: the square and the triangle. There is no way you can, I mean, these are like 2 cornerstones if you want. The triangle is to highlight, again, there are several layers here, but it's to highlight always the concept of 3. There are 3 dimensions, there could be 3 elements, there could be 3 levels, there could be 3 natures. There's always 3, and that's where you see triangle, then you can see 2 triangles with the 6, then you can see 3 triangles, then you have the 9, etc. 3, 3, 3. That's one thing, the triangle. The next one is the square. And the square has also different esoteric meanings in Masonry. One very important meaning that we always tell the Mason is that the square brings 2 virtues together and put them at a state of equilibrium. And that is the concept of equality, equal sides, and then rectitude, 90-degree angles, perpendicular lines. And that explains to you expressions in English like fair and square, or a square deal, or to be on the square. And if someone is doing something that is not quite right, we say he or she's cutting corners. In other words, they're not squaring them. There's something not right. So, which explains to you why the District of Columbia, George Washington, put the language in the law, the Federal District Act, saying that the District of Columbia would be a 10-mile square. In other words, this new experiment would operate on the square.
Then I lost the Virginia piece, so it ended up with not a square.
In 1846, unfortunately Virginians took, but and what does it say? But the idea is that this new form of government would operate on the square differently from the old order. Now, so that's one thing. The other thing, the square refers also points. You have the 4 corners, so the 4 cardinal points. It's geometry, it's science, it's reason. Also, the square has to do with the 4 elements. The 4 dimensions, 4 natures of the human being, as John Fetzer mentioned. Then these 4 relate to the 4 elements: earth, wind, fire, and water. And water being, the spiritual, earth being, the physical, emotional is air, volatile, and then zeal of the intellect, there is fire. So, and the Mason, in some of the degrees and rituals, you go through the trial of the 4 elements and how do you get to understand the mastery of dealing with the 4 elements, etc. So it makes sense. And the 2 come together. the square, and the triangle. The triangle is to remind you who you are, yourself, how you operate at the different levels, the different natures, the different beings. And you're working always in this plane, which is governed on earth by the square. And I would add here something, because in the triangle, which would make sense then in what he had in mind, because one of the relationships in the three is that there is the individual, the lodge, and the community. In other words, that's the three, and the person, the Freemason, needs to put these three in equilibrium. Work towards as much as possible to make it an equilateral triangle. But it's a triangle. So now if you take that and project it to John Fetzer's perspective, there is him, John Fetzer, who he has become, how he transformed himself, what he believes in. The Fetzer Institute becomes his lodge. That is, this is where the Fetzer, what he created is the incubator. This is the lab, which is but for what? In order then to move to the world. That is, what is this lodge preparing Masons? What are they going to do in the world? In this case, what is this institute going to do to improve the human condition? And the inspiration is coming from above. I mean, that's how I perceive the triangle pointing downward.
At the Fetzer Institute, we have the winged horse over the front door. We have the dual goddesses at the back door, Isis and her sister Nephthys. And also in D.C., there are symbols of the winged horse, and there are types of winged horses even in this building. In the apotheosis of Washington at the dome of the Capitol, we have Washington with dual goddesses on either side, liberty and victory. So it raises to mind for me this classic Egyptian drawing is of the god Osiris in the center, surrounded in protection on either side by the two goddesses, Isis and Nephthys, with their protective wings. And over his head is the winged horse, the soul flying free into the heavens. So for John, those are the key symbols of the building. That's what he had put at the front entrance, the back entrance, and John was the king of the place, so he was the Osiris. What is the Masonic symbolism of that? Because it's very prevalent in Masonry as well. So from a Masonic point of view, what do those symbols say about the building and about John's mission?
Well, from one way to look at the interpretation of the symbols for the Mason itself, it has to do with the person rising up to the divine. So it is divine emancipation, and this is the reason why if you're thinking about the two goddesses here, then in the lodge room you got the two pillars and the two squares, and then you have the canopy of heaven, and depending on the lodge decorum, we always talk about the sun. You don't necessarily see it all the time, and your being the soul is growing your soul to lift you to become, from a divine perspective, truly a free individual. This is about enlightened freedom again. Now, this is as far as the Mason is concerned. And if you look at the symbols that have to do with the ritual and the lodge, that's what it means. Now, transpose that. I mean, George Washington fulfilled his true destiny of freedom by helping accomplish what he was destined to accomplish, and that is to be the builder par excellence among the founders. Without George Washington, the experiment might not have taken hold. Don't ever forget the biggest debate in Philadelphia that almost wrecked the entire convention had to do with Article 2 of the Constitution, defining the powers of the presidency. What does executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States? What does that mean? And they argued forever. And then if it weren't for Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania standing up and saying, why are we arguing? I mean, we know who is the person whom we can trust to be president. Let's keep it vague and let him. We trust that he, guided by providence, will shape the powers of the presidency and will set the parameters. I mean, what a leap of faith. So Washington, in the apotheosis that you see in the Capitol building, makes absolute sense. And God, same symbolism. Now, if you want to take that to the Fetzer Institute, that is basically John Fetzer saying, I have laid a huge foundation for you guys. I'm leaving here a legacy. And the destiny of this institute is to help promote spiritual freedom. Are you capable of doing it?
So the fact that these symbols again appear on the building seems to suggest that it's a lodge.
I would, if I were to enter his mind, I mean, this is what struck me. I said, that's what it is, because it's the concept of the lodge. Forget the administrative side. The concept of the lodge is the incubator, where these energies, using the symbols around you, rituals, is to unleash these energies and help the individual connect with that so they can be more creative, free creative agents and better the human condition. So to me, it makes sense then, if this is his vision, and he created an institution dedicated to trying to do that, then he had to design it with things to remind the people who are going to work there why they're there. Why are you there?